Welcome back to Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes. Thanks for coming back to Ernie Pyle Part 4. And if you haven't watched the first 3 episodes of the Ernie Pyle series, I hope that you take the time to watch them. Let's do a short review of Ernie Part 3. Ernie has become the #1 war correspondent in America. Book number 2, Here Is Your War, is published. Hollywood producer Lester Cohen would get the rights to make a movie about Ernie from his writings. He rejoins the military, first with the Navy and then with the Army during the invasion of Sicily, also known as Operation Husky. He would meet General George Patton and spend 3 days with General Omar Bradley. Ernie would spend 5 days in a field hospital being diagnosed with battlefield fever. Here he would listen to the moans of the injured, listened to soldiers demanding to be allowed to get back with their units, even though they still had a lot of healing to do, and the prayers of the chaplains as they pray over soldiers as they took their last breaths. Afterwards, he realizes that he is physically and emotionally exhausted. He will return to the U.S. First, he visits his father in Indiana, who was in the hospital, and then he heads home to Jerry in Albuquerque. She is still medically and emotionally frail, but she tries to be brave, because after the Allies invade Italy, Ernie knows that he must go back. After leaving New Mexico, he heads to Washington, D.C. to get arrangements made for his travel to Italy. There are also meetings about the movie. Ernie insists that the focus of the movie be on the soldiers, not him. It was nearly 3 weeks before he was ready to head out. After he's packed and ready to go, Ernie writes to Jerry, "Darling, it's awful for us to face the start of another such long separation, but I want you to feel one thing, that you needn't worry about me. I'll be all right physically, for now that I've sort of been through the mill, I'm not going to take any unnecessary chances this time. I'm glad you think I'm wonderful and great, but I think that about you too. Whatever this fame business is, you're as much responsible as I am, for you have given me more in character than anyone else in the world. If I could only have your depth of honesty and sincerity, I might think I was really great, but great or not, we've both got so much to live for. We've got everything if we could just have ourselves, and I'm convinced that when I come back again, we will have that. I love you, darling. I can't conceive of going on without you. So be there big and strong for me when I come back." Ernie spent 3 days in Miami, where he met Al Jolson, who had just returned from entertaining the troops in Africa and Sicily. Jolson would later tell a reporter, "Everywhere I went, the soldiers told me how wonderful Ernie Pyle was. Heck, he doesn't even sing or dance, and I couldn't figure out what he did to entertain them. But they acted like he was Mr. God." Then, after leaving Miami and flying via South America, he would finally return to Algiers. Ernie receives a warm welcome home when he reaches Algeria. He sees so many soldiers that he knows, and he would even hear "Welcome home" from soldiers he had never met. After this, Ernie knew that the old fraternity of war had embraced him once more. And everybody wants to know what it's like for their families back home in America. They would ask, "Can you get enough to eat? Can you still have fun? Can you get milk and eggs? Are prices terribly high?" He would reassure the soldiers by telling them that yes, there is enough to eat, but you may have to go meatless a couple of days a week. And yes, you can get milk and eggs. Gas rationing makes getting around a little harder, but they manage. He winds up telling them that the country hasn't changed as much as they think it has. Ernie would make his way to Italy, where heavy fighting was happening. He would be up at the front and then go back to the city, stay in a hotel to write his columns, and then go back to the battlefront. A friend of his, Don Whitehead, who was an AP reporter, visited Ernie at his hotel, and Ernie had wanted to write a series about the mule pack trains. Don would find Ernie in his room working. Ernie would tell him, "I've lost my touch. The stuff stinks. I just can't seem to get going again. He gave Don 3 columns and asked, "What do you think of 'em?" The first one Don Whitehead picked up was the death of Captain Waskow. Don would say that the simplicity and beauty of that description brought tears to my eyes. This was the kind of writing all of us were striving for, the picture we were trying to paint in words for the people back home. Don would also say, if this is a sample from a guy who has lost his touch, then the rest of us had better go home. On December 14, 1943, 25-year-old Captain Henry Waskow was with the 36th Infantry Division fighting the Germans in the mountains of Italy. Hearing incoming shells, the captain pushed his messenger, Riley Tidwell, to the ground, and before he could save himself, he was struck in the chest by shrapnel, being killed almost instantly. Ernie would arrive at the area and met Riley Tidwell, who couldn't help but show his agony at the death of the captain. He would tell Ernie that the captain was like a father to him. Tidwell waited several days for the captain's body to be brought down from the mountains. Fearing that the captain would be left, Tidwell would finally take a mule and bring down the body himself. When Ernie returned to his hotel room, he would write his column about Captain Waskow. He was not able to publish it immediately because the captain's family needed to be notified of his death first. It was published on January 10, 1944. This column would become his most famous, his most loved. The following is an excerpt from this column. I was at the front of the mule trail that night they brought Captain Waskow's body down. The moon was nearly full at the time, and you could see far up the trail and even part way across the valley below. Soldiers made shadows in the moonlight as they walked. Dead men had been coming down the mountain all evening, lashed onto the backs of mules. They came lying belly down across the wooden pack saddles, their heads hanging down on the left side of the mule, their stiffened legs sticking out awkwardly from the other side, bobbing up and down as the mule walked. The first one came early in the evening. They slid him down from the mule and stood him on his feet for a moment while they got a new grip. In the half light, he might have been merely a sick man standing there, leaning on the others. Then they laid him on the ground in the shadow of the low stone wall alongside the road. I don't know who that first one was. You feel small in the presence of dead men and ashamed at being alive, and you don't ask silly questions. 4 mules stood there in the moonlight, in the road where the trail came down off the mountain. The soldiers who led them stood there waiting. "This one is Captain Waskow," one of them said quietly. 2 men unlashed his body from the mule and lifted it off and laid it in the shadow beside the stone wall. You don't cover up dead men in the combat zone. They just lie there in the shadows until somebody else comes after them. The men in the road seemed reluctant to leave. They stood around, and gradually, one by one, I could sense them moving closer to Captain Waskow's body. Not so much to look, I think, as to say something in finality to him and to themselves. I stood close by, and I could hear. One soldier came and looked down and said out loud, "Damn it." That's all he said, and then he walked away. Another one came, and he said, "Damn it to hell anyway." He looked down for a few moments, and then he turned and left. Then the first man squatted down, and he reached down and took hold of the dead hand, and he sat there for 5 full minutes, holding the dead hand in his own, and looked intently into the dead face, and he never uttered a sound all the time he sat there. And then, finally, he put the hand down, and then he reached up and gently straightened the points of the captain's shirt collar, and then he sort of rearranged the tattered edges of his uniform around the wound. And then he got up and walked away down the road in the moonlight, all alone. I wanted to talk about some of Ernie's columns that he wrote in Italy, so I've picked 3 of them. For the first story, he talks about several Air Force units, and he would say that they were lousy with Hoosiers. His original thought was taking down all the names so he could put them in his column. Well, The list got so long that he ended up just picking one name, and that was 22-year-old Lieutenant James F. Short of Clinton, Indiana. Lieutenant Short had been in the Army for 4 years, and he claimed to be a 90-day wonder. He was the assistant operations officer of his squadron. And the reason Ernie picked him out of all of the Hoosiers was because Lieutenant Short was born and raised 5 miles from where he had been born in Dana. Then he tells how an accident can become a good thing. A bomber outfit was making a run with a brand new replacement pilot out on his first mission. The target was close to the American lines, and as the outfit was making their turn, the new pilot swung way out of formation. After realizing his mistake and that he was about to get left behind, he dropped all of his bombs. The squadron leader saw the bombs drop and was just sure that they would land on American troops. Shortly after they landed, the squadron leader was called to the phone by a general. And when a general calls, you can just bet that it's going to be really bad. The general boomed, "Say, who is the crazy pilot that left your formation and dropped his bombs off to the side?" The squadron leader was ready to faint. He was just waiting to hear that those bombs had killed 300 American troops. Then the general shouted, "Well, whoever he was, give him my congratulations. He got a direct hit on a gun we've been trying to get for 2 weeks. Wiped it out. Excellent work." I can only imagine how the squadron leader felt after hearing that. And for the third story, he told how a Major Ed Bland, who was a commander of a dive bomber squadron, had gone from being a popular commander to being the most envied man in the squadron. And the reason for this was that he had become acquainted with a naval officer, and the Navy had access to items that the Army wasn't. But luckily, the Navy did like to share with their Army friends. And what did Major Bland get his hands on that made him extremely popular, you may ask? It was 5 cases of Coca-Cola. As the fighting continues in Italy, the fighting in Anzio started on January 22nd, 1944. Ernie would end up going there, and he stayed in a villa that was on the beachfront. And he shared the house with 5 officers, 12 enlisted men, and 11 other correspondents. The house was huge with 4 stories down on the beach, and then a section with 3 stories just above. Everyone lived in the bottom section, feeling it to be the safest location. Ernie alone stayed upstairs because he felt the light was better. The Germans bombed this area nightly, and the bombs landed around the villa, never hitting it. But in the early morning hours of March 17th, all that would change. The villa was hit. The ceilings broke open, plaster and bricks would crumble. The men on the bottom floor checked on each other and found that they all had survived the bombardment, and they all knew that the upper floors had to have been destroyed and that Ernie was killed. A moment later, Ernie came down the stairs with blood trickling from a single tiny cut on his face. Ernie would tell them he was awake and lying in bed when the anti-aircraft guns let loose. He normally stayed in bed, but this morning he got up, put on his steel helmet, slipped on a pair of slippers, and went to look out the window. He had just reached the window when a blast swirled him around and threw him in the middle of the room. Half of the window had been ripped out and thrown across the room. The glass was blown into thousands of little pieces. He had no idea how he ended up not getting hit by any of the flying debris. He jumped into one corner of the room and squatted down and just cowered there, thinking for sure that this was the end. Suddenly, one whole wall of his room flew in, burying his bed under hundreds of pounds of brick, stone, and mortar. Later, they found the steel frame of the bed broken and twisted. Doors were blown off. His steel hat was blown off. Ernie could not believe that with all of the flying glass and debris, the only wound was a tiny cut on his right cheek. Had he not gotten off the bed when he did? After the elation of being alive wore off, he started getting jumpy, and by mid-afternoon he felt very old and beat up. By the middle of April, Ernie is back in London. And May of 1944 was quite a month for Ernie. He had placed a bet of $100 with his friend and boss, Lee Miller that he would not win the Pulitzer Prize, but on May 1st he lost that bet. This was one bet he was happy to lose. And on May 2nd, he would win the Raymond Clapper Memorial Award, and then on May 5th, he received the Hoosier of the Year Award. I must say, not bad for a little guy from Dana, Indiana. While in Italy, Ernie would write columns saying that he felt the combat soldiers should receive fight pay. Pilots received flight pay, and he believed that it was only right and fair that the soldier in combat should receive the extra pay as well. In May of 1944, the House would vote on the combat pay increase. It would pass, and it would be known as the Ernie Pyle Bill. The planning for Operation Overlord was going on. This was the planning for the Allied invasion of Normandy, to start pushing the Nazis back through France and back to Germany. Several dates were being considered, but finally, in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, would begin the invasion that the whole world had been waiting for, with over 150,000 American, British, and Canadian troops. Ernie was on board a naval ship on June 6th. He would go ashore on June 7th, landing on Omaha Beach. And once again, in the only way Ernie could, he would write an amazing column about the walk he took along the sandy beach the day after D-Day. He would write, "I took a walk along the historic coast of Normandy in the country of France. It was a lovely day for strolling along the seashore. Men were sleeping on the sand, some of them sleeping forever. Men were floating in the water, but they didn't know they were in the water, for they were dead." He also wrote, "I walked for a mile and a half along the water's edge of our many-miled invasion beach. You wanted to walk slowly, for the detail on that beach was infinite. The wreckage was vast and startling. The awful waste and destruction of war, even aside from the loss of human life, has always been one of its outstanding features to those who are in it. Anything and everything is expendable, and we did expend on our beachhead in Normandy during those first few hours. For a mile out from the beach, there were scores of tanks and trucks and boats that you could no longer see, for they were at the bottom of the water, swamped by overloading or hit by shells or sunk by mines. Most of their crews were lost." This is just a sample of what he wrote about the invasion of Normandy. Ernie stayed with the military as they fought their way towards Paris. He would be the only war correspondent who didn't take a break and go back to London. He was there when 250 wounded prisoners from the 82nd Airborne were liberated from a military hospital. He was nearly killed by American bombers. He would be the cover story of Time magazine on July 17, 1944. His Hollywood movie was still progressing. Lester Cohen was trying to find an actor to cast as Ernie. Plus, talks of a third book had begun. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. Ernie would write, "I had thought that for me there could never again be any elation in war. But I had reckoned without the liberation of Paris. I had reckoned without remembering that I might be a part of this richly historic day. We are in Paris on the first day, one of the great days of all time." He would also write, "The streets were lined as by 4th of July parade crowds at home, only this crowd was almost hysterical. The streets of Paris are wide, and they were packed on each side. The women were all brightly dressed with flowers in their hair. As our jeep eased through the crowds, thousands of people crowded up. Frantic men, women, and children grabbed us and kissed us and shook our hands and beat on our shoulders and slapped our backs and shouted their joy as we passed. We all got kissed until we were literally red in the face, and I must say, we enjoyed it." 2 days after the liberation of Paris, Ernie would telegram his friend and boss, Lee Miller, asking if he could start planning his return home. Before leaving France for London, Ernie wrote, "This is the last of these columns from Europe. By the time you read this, The old man will be on his way back to America. After that will come a long, long rest. And after the rest, well, you never can tell. Undoubtedly, this seems to you to be a funny time for leaving because of a whim, or even especially because I'm homesick. I have had all I can take for a while. I've been 29 months overseas since the war started, have written around 700,000 words about it, have totaled nearly a year in the front lines. I do hate terribly to leave right now, but I have given out. The hurt has finally become too great. All of a sudden, it seemed to me that if I heard one more shot or saw one more dead man, I would go out of my mind. And if I had to write one more column, I'd collapse. So I'm on my way. I cannot help but feel bad about leaving, even hating the whole business as much as I do. You come to be a part of it, and you leave some of yourself here when you depart. Being with the American soldier has been a rich experience. To the thousands of them that I know personally, and the other hundreds of thousands for whom I have had the humble privilege of being a sort of mouthpiece, this then is to say goodbye and good luck. Thank you for watching Part 4 of my Ernie Pyle series, and I hope you enjoyed following Ernie through his time in Italy, on the beaches of Normandy, and at the liberation of Paris, plus learning that he was finally awarded the Pulitzer Prize, plus Outstanding Hoosier of the Year in 1944, and that he would finally be so worn out by war that he had to come home. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share. Also be sure to click on the notification bell so that you will be notified when the next Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes video is uploaded. Until next time.